Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm speaking with Peter Russell. Peter is a Canadian political scientist. He is the Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Toronto, where he taught from 1958 until 1997. He was the principal of Innis College at the University of Toronto from 1973 to 1978. He is the author of many books, including his most recent one, Sovereignty, the Biography of A Claim. He is the alumnus of the University of Toronto Schools, Trinity College at the University of Toronto, University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He's a 2012 winner of the American Political Science Association's Mildred Schwartz Award. He is also an officer of the Order of Canada. He was the Director of Research for the McDonald Commission, and he is a member of the Federal Task Force on Comprehensive Land Claims. He's the president of the Canadian Political Science Association and chair of the Research Advisory Committee for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So he has a well-established career. In the conversation I have with him, we talk about his new book, Sovereignty, which, to be honest, I was intrigued by the book because I hadn't really thought about the concept of sovereignty, which he told me that many people say this as well. So we first talk about how we define sovereignty. We talk about how historically one has obtained the claim of sovereignty. We talk about the mix historically of a deity or religion kind of passing down or ordaining sovereignty. We talk about the importance of Westphalia for the transition of giving sovereignty from a deity to a state. We talk about what perfecting sovereignty means. We discuss the importance of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau on the topic of sovereignty. We talk about how we got to popular sovereignty with the people and the importance of the American and French revolutions. We talk about the tragic history of sovereignty with Indigenous peoples. We talk about federalism. We talk about how we could understand sovereignty with refugees. And we talk about the future of sovereignty. I have to say, this was a really wonderful conversation. I believe Peter is almost 90. He's 88 or 89, and it's incredibly inspiring to see somebody have all their life dedicated their time and energy to research and studying and, working with Indigenous peoples and all the books he's written. I mean, it really was an honor and an inspiration for myself to see someone going into their 9th decade of life, and still writing books, still doing hard work, and he's extremely wise, I think is the best way to say it. People may agree or disagree with him, but he definitely has tremendous amounts of wisdom, and so it really was a big privilege to talk with him. And so now I bring you Peter Russell. I'm here with Peter Russell. Peter, thank you so much for coming on, sir. It's a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Xavier.
Yeah, you've written a very interesting book. The book is entitled Sovereignty, the Biography of A Claim. And I have not, I have to be very honest, I did not think about this concept. And then when I came across your book and I said, well, this is fascinating. I have not really put a lot of thought into it, and your intro was really, really cool about how you kind of came upon it and got into the claim. So before we get into the book, just tell me or just tell listeners, who you are, what you do, and all that good stuff.
I'm a professor emeritus, which means retired, at the University of Toronto, and my discipline is political science. Mm-hmm. And I started teaching here in 58. So I'm an old guy, but I'm still perking along. And I got into this in 1974 when the Dene people and Indigenous people in the Northwest Territories of Canada asked me to go up there and and they were working on a new approach to Canada, and they started right off with a question. They said, "Professor, what is sovereignty, and how did the Queen, we're in Canada, get it over us?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, I know that first question. I teach that stuff at university, but I don't know. That second question is a biggie. It's
Mm-hmm.
real big.
Mm-hmm.
How the heck did that ever happen?" And they all nodded. They said, "Yes, Professor. Big question. What's the answer?" And I said, "Damn it, I don't know. But I'm going to find out. It's just so big, not just for you, but for Indigenous people all over the place,
Yeah.
who are under some sovereign they didn't consent to." So that started me off. And my inquiry. I found my first stop was the law school, which is an eminent law school at University of Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And I knocked on the doors, about 6 professors. Everyone gave me the same answer. "Oh, that's a huge question, Peter. Of course, we have sovereignty over them. No doubt about it, Peter. Don't worry about that. We got sovereignty over those people. Well, how do we get it?" "Well, I really don't know." And that made me go and inquiry. And I didn't just go to sources in Canada. I went to other places in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I embarked on the project of this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You tell the story very well. You really kind of march us through the history of sovereignty. Is this? I'm assuming this isn't your first book, correct? You've written a few before.
It's my 19th.
Okay.
But that may say, "Well, God, that's what professors do."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We get a lot of time off. We're expected to write. Not always books. Depends on your discipline. But political science is a very literary kind of discipline.
Sure.
Its books sell well with the general public, better than books on more esoteric subjects.
Yeah, certainly.
But lots of books.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. So let's start out by how we define it, right? So how do we define sovereignty? What is the thing in itself that we're trying to define?
Well, here's how I traced it to its origins. I found it was something that people claim over others. I found its first use was in very early days in medieval Europe. And won't surprise your women listeners, men who owned land claim sovereignty over their land and all of their family. All the members of their family, quite extended family. What they mean by that? I'm the supreme authority. Everything I say goes. I'm the only legitimate authority over you, my family, my wife, my children, and anyone who comes on my land, I'm in charge of it. And that's what, I was looking for the actual word. There have always been tyrants and bullies and people making big claims to push other people around. But I was really tracked down that 11-letter word.
And so it's interesting, right? Because you make the argument in the book that it really is just a claim. And so there's two parts to this question. The first part is if it's always, or not always, but it can be sometimes sovereignty is something over another person, or does that mean that there's the other that's dependent for you need someone to be sovereign over? You can't just have it over another one?
Well, a very contemporary example of a sovereignty claim is in the Me Too movement, women claiming sovereignty over their body. That they're the only legitimate authority over what crosses the border of their body.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of over themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's, I don't go around the world saying you're using the word improperly.
Mm-hmm.
People, women who say that are making an important claim.
Sure.
Making the sovereignty claim is a speech act. It's an act of speech. And I also know poets who claim sovereignty over their soul. I've never been quite sure what souls are all about, but I respect that claim. I don't say, oh, I can't make that claim. But most of the time, like China right now is very busy trying to claim sovereignty over Taiwan, right? I mean, watch it every day in the paper.
Right.
We've got some, your country and mine got some ships down now in that very dangerous area of the Indo-Pacific. As we speak.
Yeah.
And that's sovereignty. They want sovereignty over Taiwan to be recognized.
Is kind of going back when you were talking about the history in the medieval period, is that there's, sovereignty over land and over people's families and other communities. Is there something that there's maybe an evolutionary component to this where it's, I'm big and I'm bad and, I'm able to kind of rule over you. So I was able to do that. And so now I'm the boss here. Is that kind of that claim of that's rights of sorts?
Well, language travels over time. That Frankish word, sovereignty, used first, as I told you, by land-owning men, became a political type of, a big political claim. When around 800, we're talking AD, I know that's a little, you're not supposed to talk about AD after the death of Christ, but I think people know what I mean.
Right.
Around 800 AD, Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, attributed sovereignty to God,
right,
being the absolute ruler with full authority, monopoly of legitimate authority over all humankind and the whole of creation. And Charlemagne said, well, and I'm his vicar on earth. I'm God. God got to be male, or was male at that point. So I'm just being historically accurate when I.
Right.
I'm God's vicar here on earth, his only vicar. I have a direct line of communication. Right. So I'm not sovereign, even though I'm Holy Roman Emperor. God's above me. I'm below God. But I'm his only vicar. But the problem was the guy who anointed Charlemagne, put the crown on his head on Christmas Day, 800, was a pope. And the pope made his imperial rule legitimate. Well, if the Pope, doesn't that sort of put the Pope above the emperor? And the Pope certainly thought so. And then for about 4 or 5 centuries, this may surprise your readers, ones who don't know that period of history, from 800 up to 1500, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, they duked it out. Who was the legitimate representative of God on earth? Which of them? And it showed the danger of this absolute claim. I mean, that's a big claim, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly.
My God, it raises the stakes. And though the Pope was a religious figure, organized military force and groups in Europe armed themselves to defend the Pope, and the Emperor had his military supporters. So millions of people were killed over the conflicting sovereignty claims.
Is it, yeah, this part of early on in the book, you talk about how sovereignty was, kind of during this period, just directly from God. And you talk about this conflictual, contentious nature between the Pope and whoever the ruler was for hundreds of years. Was that just something that as culture became, as you had the spread of Christianity into the West and you had no separation of church and state, was that just a kind of religious time period where we say, this is how it goes?
Yes, Xavier, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very, very religious period in Western Europe, compared with the secularism that comes on after the Reformation and the Enlightenment and modernity, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
There was no separation of church and state. So it was consonant with that kind of a political and social culture.
Yeah, so it sounds like the claim of sovereignty in itself with just human intervention was, well, I can be over you. But now if I have, a deity that is also behind my back, behind my claim I'm making, now I have more emphasis here.
Yeah, that's right. It really adds something to among believers.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't work today.
Yeah, right.
If most people believed if they defy the religious authorities or priests or pope, they'll rot in hell, they'll burn in hell
mm-hmm.
for eternity. They got a powerful incentive to fall in line.
Yeah. Yeah.
You say, what's a crazy belief? Well, lots of beliefs are crazy
sure,
at their
sure.
time, but they did. Most Western Europeans believe that.
Yeah. And so so this is going on for a little bit and for a couple hundred years. And then there's this period called Westphalia, which, you say was important for the transition of sovereignty from a god or God to the state. So tell us about that period and why that was so important.
Well, that comes in the 1600s, mm-hmm. after mm-hmm. centuries of conflict, and particularly in the 1500s with Martin Luther, with the Reformation. Remember, this is a very religious age of culture still, sure. But now religions are fighting, Christian religions are fighting. After over a century of warfare that killed millions of people, mm-hmm. there was finally an attempt to bring peace at Westphalia, which is a small town in the northern Rhineland, mm-hmm. Just to place it in what we now know, in what we now call Germany.
Right. And
the aim was to make peace, and the great powers came there. Britain wasn't there, but France and Spain were, and the Netherlands was a big player because they were broken away from Spain, and it was Protestant. Mm-hmm. And they made peace. It's called the Peace of Westphalia. And the key to it was that the big powers that made treaties with one another said, we may not agree with your religion because you're a Protestant or the Protestants. Mm-hmm. They said, we don't agree with you Catholics, but we will not invade your country. We will not cross your borders because we don't like your form of Christianity. Mm. And so there'll be states that have control over their borders. And we say, well, what else is new? That is new. Mm-hmm. That was the idea of states rather than empires, yeah. or small little towns and villages. The idea of states, I didn't say nation states, but just of states, as sort of intermediate type of political unit, exercising control over their country and their people. That's what emerges from the Treaty of Westphalia and becomes the basis for a system of international law.
Mm-hmm. Now, is this something that is, in terms of how, at the time, and even still now as we see it today of sorts, we see ripples of it, but that there needs to be an element of scale. So how do we have I don't want to say control, but how do we have sovereignty over mass amounts of people? Well, if it's not a deity, and it's not God, and it's not, some supreme ruler in that way, well, then we'll just disperse it to heads of state, people in charge of running this. Was it kind of this moving of from God to now groups of people or one person in control of the state, but there's still somebody that has to be over, all the rest of people?
Not somebody,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of an individual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But you have to, there are two dimensions of being able to be success in making the sovereign claim.
Mm-hmm.
Writers call it perfecting the sovereign claim.
Hmm.
Because you or I, Xavier, could make a sovereign claim over here in the Appalachians, and I'm in Toronto, and they won't be worth a damn.
Right. Right.
But to make a sovereign claim, you have to be effective. You have to back it up. You must have the
Mm-hmm.
military force, the strength, so that if someone says, I don't think you're sovereign, I'll come and overthrow you either from the inside or a movement inside your country or from outside, you're not effective. That you're not going to be successful in asserting your sovereignty claim. The other thing is legitimacy. An invading sovereign might be able to invade a country. China may be able to invade Taiwan. But the other dimension of sovereignty, is it legitimate? Is it legitimate to the people? Is it just based on, in the country? Is it just based on force?
Mm-hmm.
Has it no internal legitimacy? And what about the outside? What does the world think?
Yeah.
Do they say, hey, good for you, China? I don't think the United States or Canada are going to do that if China successfully invades Taiwan. I think they're going to question the legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
So claims to be successful, or to use the technical language, to be perfected,
Mm-hmm.
have to be effective and legitimate, force and moral rightness.
So this because we see that today, right? You see many coup governments, and we'll say, well, they're not legitimate, or they are legitimate, or whatever. Sure. But it sounds like this element of legitimacy or perfected element that you're saying kind of starts here in this, Enlightenment or pre-Enlightenment era, post-Reformation eras, where we start to see this. And so then it kind of just going through it, as you mentioned in the book, then we get to Hobbes, right? And, Leviathan is a important piece of literature. And there's many subsequent thinkers. So, for Hobbes, he believed that sovereignty was from deductive human reasoning. So how do you understand, I guess, the two different circumstances in which men may submit to sovereignty, right? And for Hobbes, why did he place that in a ruler as opposed to, with people or with political pluralism or something else?
Well, as to your last question, he placed it in the ruler because he was afraid that if people of England did not accept the sovereignty of their king, there'd be civil war.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't, seemed to be the fate of man was to be perpetually at war. The best way to prevent that tendency in Homo sapiens, it's also in other parts of nature, is to have someone in control that everybody respects.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he wasn't a Democrat, and there wasn't much of a democratic movement when Hobbes wrote the Leviathan.
Mm-hmm.
So he put his faith in the English monarch. But he wrote as a generalist for all humankind, which we now know is a very arrogant, culturally naive way for anyone to write, including Europeans, who are generalizing about all the rest of humankind.
Yeah. So I guess how do we understand then the consolidation of both creating a monopolization of all legitimate lawmaking power in one central government, or if it's a monarchy, or if it's a ruler, and not having groundwork for legitimate power between state and individual, right? Is there some egalitarian piece there, or is there more towards a monarchy or aristocracy is what it sounds like? So how does he kind of see it?
Well, he doesn't help us much with that because he has no room for making the monarch's sovereign rule conditional on observing certain rights or principles. It's John Locke. You're an American, I assume, Xavier,
yes,
who is the philosopher of two revolutions, the Whig Revolution in England and the American Revolution, who attached conditions to the duty to obey a government claiming sovereignty. And the main condition was respecting what he called property rights. We say that's a narrow conception of rights, but he meant that in a much broader way. So if you don't, if the government doesn't respect your rights, you have a right, a legitimate right to rebel. And your American forebears did that.
Certainly. Certainly.
While carrying them on in his grave.
Is that so there's a conditional piece, and then obviously, Hobbes has a very kind of cynical outlook, right? Everyone's going to just eventually lead the Civil War and kill each other. But are those the only differences between Hobbes and Locke, or are there other distinct differences?
Oh no, there's more to it, because Locke has more confidence in our species, in Homo sapiens. And he thinks, whereas Hobbes didn't have that, but he thought if there's no ruler around it, it's just going to be perpetual war. But Locke thought a political society could function, at least temporarily, without government and create a government in a kind of democratic way. He's much more optimistic that human beings could form a political contract with one another.
And so I guess it's interesting because it really does seem like there are these two kinds of worldviews or philosophies about how to construct, some type of governance or somehow who has sovereignty. And so I know you mentioned in the book that, Locke has an idea of a social contract, but I guess how is that different from Rousseau's social contract, right? So now we're really getting to splitting the atom here, because is one, in terms of Locke's understanding of the social contract, just simply about liberties, and Rousseau is about collective freedoms, or is it much more nuanced?
Well, Rousseau is different because he believes people contract with one another to form a political society, and that's it. And that makes the people sovereign. I mean, he is the ultimate philosopher of popular sovereignty, which is the inspiration of the democratic age, French Revolution.
So in terms of their differences are, you were saying that with Locke, there's this idea that there's somewhere deep in the misty past, there was also some type of social contract.
Yeah.
But with Rousseau, he was really the pushing and propelling this idea for the French Revolution and others for popular sovereignty, that people could kind of self-govern as those sorts.
Yes. And that's when sovereignty, as I put in my book, it's moved from God to the state, Westphalia, and now to the people. And the climax of that is 1789, the French Revolution. I know the Americans got their revolution in a little earlier than that,
right.
But that, in terms of a worldwide event, is where I trace the climax of the movement to attribute sovereignty, attribute to the people. Of course, I think what your viewers will appreciate, it's not really the people. The people, if the people ever turned up, governments who claim sovereignty in their name would be horrified. They're not expected to turn up. The people and the nation, and they were for Rousseau the same thing. The nation and the people are convenient fictions. So after the French Revolution, as you know, if you know anything about Napoleon and the restoration of the French monarchy, there were very autocratic, dictatorial rulers who ruled in the name of the people. You got it. Because from that time until today, if anyone says I get my authority from anything other than the people, they're dead in the water, however autocratic they are. If they say the only basis for my rule is an armed bunch of people who help me make a coup, that's not going to work. You have to say, I represent the people, even though the people are a fiction and you hope they never turn up. I don't like to sound cynical. Some countries who believe in the people being sovereign are extremely democratic, like the United States and Canada. So there are some autocratic countries. I mean, ask the supporters of Putin, who is sovereign in Russia, and they'll say the Russian people, and Putin rules in our name. At least those who believe in him.
Right. Well, you're absolutely right about the climax, right? The French Revolution. I see the American and the French Revolution as, they're very, kind of connected, there's a lot of overlap. And that's kind of how the book goes too. You have the historical kind of aspects of sovereignty, and then we kind of get to kind of modern sovereignty. And so I guess the big question here, it's interesting how this claim, the sovereignty claim, keeps evolving. So I guess the one question here for modern from times is, how did imperialism show a form of sovereignty in Europe? Right, you have many European countries now, having this imperialistic way of trying to overtake other countries and build bigger kingdoms, and that's not necessarily new. But how does it look, at least for Western European countries in the 19th century? How did that kind of spell out?
The age of imperialism.
Yeah. Yes.
When European countries, European powers, go out and kind of dominate the rule and impose their sovereignty, impose it, and get away with it all over the globe, spectacularly in the Indo-Pacific region. But they, as once explained to me by an Australian native person, their claim were backed by a temporary advantage in military and naval technology. Armed force was really the key, not the consent of the people they dominated. So European sovereignty was, for most of the globe, an imposition of sovereignty that may have been for a time effective, but it wasn't seen at the time in the countries and among the peoples they dominated. It wasn't seen as legitimate. It may have been seen as legitimate as from the outside, because at least from European point of view, because again, Christianity was playing a big role, and there was the assumption if you weren't Christian, you weren't civilized. And if you're not civilized, well, what the hell? You should invite us in to civilize you. So that's how European imperialism really got rolling.
It sounds like there's this, again, kind of at different points throughout the various ages, that kind of what you were saying, this perfected sovereignty is that it always is supported or backed by, if I got a lot of gunpowder, or if I got a lot of arms, or if I got a lot of people, well, there's nothing you can do about it, right? And so it's interesting.
Taiwan is really army, and they're really welcoming U.S. and Canadian and other European Western armed force. They know that to claim their people's their government, speaking for the people of Taiwan, to make the claim that it's a legitimate government exercising sovereignty in Taiwan. China would be illegitimate. They're going to need armed force.
Yeah.
And I guess for the world, we're hoping it doesn't come to an armed battle, because we have the threat of weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, it's a very tricky situation.
It's a very tricky. It's one of the really crisis points of conflicting sovereignty claims right now.
Yeah.
The other, I think, is in Israel and Palestine.
Certainly. Yeah. I could be misremembering this, but I want to say that somewhere in the book you had said that there was a certain component where Europeans were concerned about indigenous people's rights when they were kind of kicking down the door and taking over folks and stuff like that. Is that true, that there was some concern for their rights? Or
sure. Well, take the British and their alliances with indigenous people, several nations. The Iroquois, or their proper name is the Haudenosaunee, in the Salbec, and they're almost a civilization that includes the Ojibwa and the Chippewa. And Britain allied with them and made treaties with them. You don't ally and make treaties with people you think you have sovereignty over. You're respecting implicitly their independence and their sovereignty. And they did that and to hold back the westward expansion of the United States of America. And their aim was to establish a buffer state, an indigenous state, along the Ohio River and right up into what is today Michigan and Wisconsin.
One other aspect of this that you say is that for Europe and their imperial states, having sovereignty over certain indigenous peoples and lands in the New World was to also ward off competition. How can we know this, or know that this was a primary reason?
Well, it stands to reason. What the European powers tended to do at first was just make alliances with local rulers. I mean, that's how the Raj acted in India. It didn't rule India, the British Raj. There are lots of Dutch and Portuguese and French activity trying to line up markets, and what they tended to look for is a local power, and they would back that local power, even supply it with arms if it was loyal to the British. They didn't actually set up a British government. They were happy to let the people govern through their traditional governments, as long as they made good economic arrangements congenial to Britain's economic interests and its military interests. It wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that the British Raj actually claimed to rule India. Queen Victoria becomes an empress.
Yeah.
And then that doesn't go very well.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it was
lasts too long.
Yeah, too long is quite brutal. You mentioned quite also brutal. in the book some of the that you mentioned the Indian Act, and what were some of these very pernicious aspects of the Indian Act, and how is it that, you know, indigenous nations can claim their own sovereignty? We keep making this idea about claims and sorts, but tell us a little about the Indian Act, and there's some pretty terrible parts about it, and then the separate question about indigenous tribes making their own sovereignty claims.
Well, I guess it's a Canadian national piece of legislation that came in the 1870s, and it is based on the assumption that the Parliament of Canada is sort of a sovereign authority over Indigenous people. It had many amendments to it, and its worst amendments occurred more in the 1990s when it was getting into education, and it introduced legislation that empowered the government and the Mounties, the Northwest Mounted Police, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, empowered them to put children in residential schools and keep them there, separate from their families, and brutalizing them physically, culturally, not allowing them to speak their language, shaming them for their traditional dances and clothing, so on. Tried to force one of the perpetrators, a bureaucrat in Ottawa, and one of Canada's famous poets, Duncan Scott, said, "Take the Indian out of the child." And it didn't work, but what it did do, at least a quarter of all the children in those schools never got home. They died. And now we're finding more bodies of those who they didn't even acknowledge their death. They just buried them without any recognition of them in the ground. Now we're finding really hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of buried Indian children.
Absolutely.
It's very disturbing.
Yeah, it's very tragic. It's terrible.
It's just tragic. It was just brutal, horrible.
Yeah. Is there some way in which, you know, again, you may not know this, but is it just one of those cases where for many indigenous tribes, they were just overpowered? There's a nation, they have a lot of people, they have a lot of artillery, they have a lot of weapons. We can't win. We're just going to lose, or what do you think it was that around the world this happens so often?
They were certainly outgunned, but that wasn't that wasn't the main reason for their failure to defend their own sovereignty. It was medical disease. Even conservative estimates are that maybe as many as 3/4 of Indigenous people who came in touch with white people got diseases for which their immune system had not prepared them. Many of the whites, most of the whites were descendants of Europeans who survived the plague and had an immune system. We didn't know anything about immune systems.
Right.
We were absolutely ignorant about the spread of disease. And epidemiology was a branch of medicine that had not really developed. And it was a real killer. And it wasn't just physically, it was spiritual. The Indigenous people, and there are all kinds of records, were very spiritual. And they believed that they'd done something wrong in the eyes of their creator. They were being punished.
Mm.
You would say, that's nonsense. It's just these goddamn white people.
Mm-hmm.
But so there was tremendous depression.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine losing, most of your family suddenly, not knowing why. And in an age where medical science was very primitive compared with today, you might well attribute it to your own fault, your own bad things you've done, and not understanding why. What have I done wrong? And there's so many, we're capturing now oral history of Indigenous people. Find that's the question they keep asking. Why is this happening to me? Well, to my family.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Yeah, it's very, very sad. The first part of your answer reminds me of I had a conversation not that long ago with Kyle Harper, who's a historian, and he wrote a book recently called "Plagues Upon the Earth," where he details the history of plague and disease on the planet. And kind of 3/4 of the way, as he gets more to current times, he talks about how with the slave trade and with many people from Europe coming over to the Americas, many people dying because of disease that were, their immune systems had no idea what this was. And, it was very, very tragic because they were just dying in waves, along with the them overpowering them by might. So you give towards the end of the book kind of your I don't want to say answer or solution to sovereignty, but you see it, I kind of took it that way as a kind of answer for some of these things about federalism. And so how do you usually define that? How do you provide examples of the similarities and differences in the United States and within the European Union?
Okay, well, let's do a definition. In a sort of slogan way, federalism is a way of organizing a political community that provides self-rule with shared rule. Mm-hmm. Self-rule with shared rule. In the United States, states have a good deal of self-rule, but their people share the whole American people as voters and political candidates share a role in your national government. So, and the key to it is independent powers at each level. The government of the United States can't just say, well, we're sick and tired of these damn states. I'm the president. I'm going to introduce legislation in Congress to curb the powers of states. Mm-hmm. And a state can't just say, I'm sick and tired of Washington. I'm going to pass a law that prevents the federal government from doing this anymore. Federal states have divided the sovereign power to make laws between independent authorities, but within a common shared sovereign state. The U.S. is a sovereign state recognized at the United Nations, as is Canada. So I put it this way, Xavier. It's a hard thing for people to grasp, but let's do it. Mm-hmm. Federalism takes the sting out of sovereignty because it means sovereign entities can share power and share community and share country and keep the state together, because I don't think my state or yours, despite prophets of doom, are about to come apart. And I think that makes the absolutism less of a beast in the sovereignty claim. Each of Canada and the U.S. as a state will claim sovereignty
Right.
and protect its boundaries. And the states and the national government will combine forces in protecting their borders. So that's where federalism comes in. It's kind of the recipe for taking the sting out of the absolutism of sovereignty. Most people want one in authority. Who's in command here? Who's in charge of this thing? Oh, shit. There's not just one. Oh, my God, there's not just one. I'm quaking and my knees are knocking. I just want, no, there's no God up there, but somebody's got to be running the show. There's a huge impulse, I'd say more among men than women, to have some big guy in charge.
Mm-hmm. It's very funny. Yes, you're absolutely right. People do have a pull for that. How is it different in the European Union? So the European Union is a more recent development, historically speaking, but and it's definitely had its kind of ups and downs over the past couple of years. But how do they do it? That's maybe different than how the United States does it.
Well, to begin with, the states 26 or 7. What's what count today? To make up the EU. Because, as we all know, the United Kingdom is out. And that's the point. The United Kingdom didn't have to fight a revolution or anything. It never gave up its sovereignty. The European Union is based on treaties, agreements, and they said we've changed our mind. We're no longer a party to this, and we're going to be an independent country. We're not going to participate in the institutions that we created along with our partner states in Europe. So they retained their sovereignty, and they now have it all by themselves. And things aren't going very well for them.
And so I guess in terms of some other additional things here, it was one of the things towards the end of the book as I was reading it, I was considering this was, how do we understand sovereignty in terms with human rights today and with refugees? When people are displaced from their home, either by many things. So, conflict, war, civil war. But now there are some, if you will, island states that are being displaced because of climate change. Their whole island is going to be underwater, and so they have no home anymore. Where they've been, there's many different ways in which refugees, exist in the current state of things. And so, how do we understand sovereignty, I guess, with human rights and just refugees or people that have refugee status?
Some big questions there, Xavier. I'll pick them apart a bit. I think you have to recognize the founding of the United Nations in 1945 is the real turning point. Because up until then, Western white European states still didn't really recognize states in the other part of the world as having the same sort of sovereign rights as they did. But at San Francisco in 1945, the founding of the UN, all the member states of the UN recognized, however small, however different in their color of their people and their belief system, however small, however large, as sovereign state members of the United Nations. And so that brought a kind of equality that had been lacking right up until 1945 with white European domination. And with that came an effort to identify and even enforce, to the best of our ability, some human rights that all human beings are entitled to, not just the rights that any given country might protect in its constitution for its own people and perhaps for visitors. But the idea of human rights with worldwide validity became an idea that much of the world embraced, and does embrace. So that was a turning point. We've had lots of disappointments, and we've seen sovereignty is often the reason for the disappointments, because we find it difficult to permit or participate in interventions in sovereign states who are so respectful of borders. But even there, we've begun to change. We have a notion of a duty to protect. And when things get really, really bad, as they are right now, today as we speak, particularly in Yemen, but earlier in the Sudan was where it began, there's a doctrine in international law that we can intervene, cross borders without the government's consent, and try to protect people from being deprived of fundamental human rights. But it's tough.
Yeah.
So.
And what about refugees? How do you understand that?
That's one of the big problems of the future.
Yes.
Is because we have refugees both for three reasons. There's political oppression. People who can't practice their religion, or their women who are not secure in having their bodies and their respected, and are kept in an inferior position. So there's political reasons. There's economic. There are parts of the world that are just unable to support people at a decent level of livelihood. And more, there's climate. Rising sea levels, particularly in the Bangladesh area, making, soon going to affect a lot of the world, including part of your Florida coast, making it unlivable on coastlines, and with governments unable to erect barriers to prevent flooding. So those are huge reasons for people to migrate. And we are having difficulty with sovereign states under great pressure from their people of the sovereign states, to protect their borders and be very picky about who gets across. Even if it means some people are in refugee camps, are living horrible lives. To protect national sovereignty, we control the borders. Now, as you may know, that's one of four reasons I have for wanting to do what a group of Americans agitated for in 1945 when they saw the UN Charter. They said, and that group included a Supreme Court judge, a couple of major businessmen, a U.S. senator, and Albert Einstein. So they weren't a bunch of fools. They were pretty profound people. They said, yeah, the UN won't be strong enough. You need a world authority that doesn't depend on the will of right now, the Security Council of the United Nations, made up of 5 countries. So, those are the permanent members of the Security Council. You have to have because sovereign states are not going to support what needs to be done to save humankind from these existential threats. The one is a secure place to live. That's migration. And I think you know the others are the danger of global warming, dangers from weapons of mass destruction, most of all nuclear, and finally, as we now know all too well, the control of diseases like COVID-19.
Right.
For that, we need a world federation. And that's where people will say, this Professor Russell's up in his tree. But I'm up in the tree with some pretty strong people in the past, some of whom I named, and some of who were leading Americans. Yeah. And I think we have to begin to think that way. So in my final, as you know, pages, I outline the necessary democratic features of an effective world government, effective only on a few issues. Most of the governing would be done in a federation that's highly decentralized by the states of the world. But on those existential things, the world government would have the power to tax and have its own military forces. Without that, it will be ineffective.
Yeah. It's very, very interesting because, you know,
that's maybe for my grandchildren.
Yeah. Well, you saying that, you know, kind of the future of sovereignty by itself would be, yeah, I could see people having various criticisms, but I think giving the whole history and context of how we understand sovereignty does make it different in how it's like, oh, well, you know, now that we see this history and how it's affected some people worse than others and how it's very troubled in many parts of its history, you would want something that is more kind of regulated. So I definitely, it definitely hits differently when it's put in within a historical context, even up until now.
Yeah.
My last question for you is, did you go back to the Indigenous group or tribe in Canada that you told us in the beginning, and did you give them an answer? I wrote a book on it, and this is what I found. And what did you tell them? What did you tell them?
I told them what I found out. It's a claim that the Queen, on behalf of the government of Canada, is and it's really the government of Canada, not Victoria, Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth. They made a claim to have sovereignty over you, and they backed it up with military force that by the time so many of you had died, you could not resist. But it wasn't legitimate. It wasn't legitimate to you. And looking back, most of us today, whether we're non-Indigenous or not, or Indigenous, say it was illegitimate. We had no right imposing our will, our sovereignty on you. You're willing to share this wonderful country with the great majority of people who are not Indigenous and share on very decent terms. And that's what we should work on. That's what I told the Dene people, and help them move towards a modern treaty with Canada.
And so what did they say?
Sorry?
What did they say when you told them this?
Well, what they said, they kept inviting me back. So they said mountains of things over the years that became, I think I can say, close friends. I guess I was up there maybe 100 times.
Wow.
And at the turn of this century, when negotiations over a modern treaty agreement with Canada broken down, and maybe this is going to amuse you a bit, Xavier. I agreed to be Canada's envoy to the Deitcho Dene people. Deitcho in Dene means big river, the Mackenzie River, one of the biggest rivers on the continent in the world. Deitcho, I was Canada's envoy to help bring Canada together with their government to work out an agreement on how to share that great country out there.
Wow.
And that's worked out reasonably well.
Wow.
But I was an envoy. I couldn't be anything. I couldn't just be a facilitator. I love that title.
Yeah. No, I mean, I had no idea how, necessarily the story would turn out. And so it is nice in that regard, knowing all the history, that there is still some happy endings.
Yes, I'd say so. There's a happy ending.
Yeah, for sure.
There. Yeah.
Well, look, the book is called Sovereignty, the Biography of a Claim. It's quite fantastic. I had never really thought about this concept, and so it kind of surprised me that I had not thought about it. So I appreciate you writing that book and for coming on here. Where can people find you? I don't know if you're online, or where can they buy your book or any of your other books or any of your other research? Where are the best places to kind of find you?
Well, they can Google me, but and they'll get my email address. University of Toronto is my publisher.
Mm-hmm.
They published my sovereignty book,
mm-hmm.
and that's if you can't find my coordinates by Googling, I'm not going to spell them all out now because you have to write them down.
Mm-hmm.
U of T Press
mm-hmm.
is very good.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, Peter, this was such a lovely conversation. You are completely, wise beyond your years, and I really enjoyed talking with you about such an important topic. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Xavier. Enjoy it. You're a very, very good interviewer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.